Welcome to Disciple Dojo. I've mentioned in a couple of previous videos that I'm in the process of doing a deep reread of my favorite trilogy of all time, C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy, sometimes called the Space Trilogy. And as part of that reread, I've also been reading some of the things that heavily influenced Lewis when he was writing it. I read Dante's Divine Comedy. This is probably the biggest influence on the Ransom Trilogy. And I've also been reading Planets in Peril, rereading that, as well as Christiana Hale's book, Deeper Heaven. And I was reading that tonight, actually, when I was out getting dinner, and I came across a passage that kind of made me think about something that I wanted to talk about here on Disciple Dojo, because it has to do with this channel. This channel is called Disciple Dojo. Our logo is literally a samurai. You see behind me, there is a katana up on my shelf. I'm a lifelong martial artist, jiu-jitsu black belt. This is actually one of the shirts that I designed with kind of the Mount Rushmore of the Gracie jiu-jitsu family. Bonus points if you can name everybody on this, by the way, those of you that do jiu-jitsu. And so I realized that one of the things that very much drew me to book one of the Space Trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, has to do with martial arts, specifically the martial part of martial arts. And so before we talk any more about that, if you haven't already, take a quick minute, tap the subscribe button. And when you do, hit that little notifications bell. Just a great way to let YouTube know we like Disciple Dojo and we want to see more of it here on YouTube. It's quick, it's easy, it's painless, it doesn't cost you a dime. Okay, so what does the Ransom Trilogy have to do with martial arts? So one of the things that C.S. Lewis was fascinated by, I mean, like enthralled with, he just thought it was the most beautiful thing. He read Dante very shortly before his conversion to Christianity. I mean, he had read, I think, in sections of it, but Paradiso, the last part, he read not long before he became a Christian. And so it was very informative on how he viewed the world. And he was a professor of medieval literature and mythology. How the ancients looked at the world utterly fascinated him to the point that he made it his profession, his career. That's what he was a scholar of first and foremost. He wasn't even a theologian, certainly not a biblical scholar, and he readily admitted that. But this is the model that Dante also patterns the Divine Comedy around, especially the third part, Paradiso, where Dante and Beatrice, his beloved, his muse, they travel through what are known as the celestial spheres, the heavens, and there are 7 of them. And so this is just an ancient depiction of it with both hemispheres of the globe. The ancients knew that we live on a globe, by the way. Then and now, flat earthers were the extreme minority, and everyone educated to any degree, even the most rudimentary basic education, knew that we lived on a globe. Now, there was all kinds of pondering about what was on the other side of that globe, like the bottom side, but they knew the for the most part, top hemisphere. And this illustration was done obviously after the so-called New World was discovered, but it still illustrates. So they believed that there was the earth, and then you had the air, like the sky. I mean, they knew what the sky was. Then you had this other realm, maybe like the ether, or where it was where fire originates, and real fire is invisible. What we see when fire burns is the impurity burning away, and the flame, the actual fire, the element of fire, goes back up to where they believed it came from, which was above the sky, up in the ether. And then above that, you had the moon. And the ancients believed that everything under the moon, everything beneath in the spheres beneath the moon, had been distorted by the fall. And the moon itself bore the scars of Satan's fall after his rebellion and being cast down from heaven. And so that's kind of like the pop marks on the moon, and you know, it's not perfect and pure like the other planets and the other stars that they saw. And that's where Dante goes in Divine Comedy when he starts his ascent towards heaven with Beatrice. Each of the 7 heavens he stops at and talks to and sees those who inhabit that realm. So the first heaven that he goes to is the moon. Then after that, the second heaven was the heaven of Mercury, was Mercury was the next planet, the next body. They called all of these, the sun, the moon, and the known planets at the time, they were just all called the planets. And they were the moving things. I mean, planet just means wanderer. That's where the name planet comes from. So the planets, the moving things, the ancients believed, like the ancient pagans believed, that these were actual gods or somehow associated with the gods, or maybe deified beings of different sorts. Well, when Christianity came along, it also had this background of observation of the skies. So the sphere of Mercury, the ruler of that was mercurial. That's where we get the word mercurial from. And it had its own qualities. And the planets could influence things on Earth. Now, it wasn't like pagan astrology where they determined, like your horoscope. It wasn't determinism. I mean, Dante has a chapter when he's in the fifth heaven that talks about determinism and God's relationship, and it's not that, but they did believe that the planets outside of the fallen sphere of sublunar Earth could exert influence. So if you were born under a certain planet, it didn't mean that you were destined to do such and such, but it meant that you had a propensity to do such and such. It was kind of like a personality type. And you can see this kind of today in the horoscopes, kind of pop horoscopes, like, oh, I'm just a Leo, I can't help it. Oh, you know what they say about Capricorns. Like, that kind of comes from all of this world sort of meshed and molded together. But the planets governed each sphere, and they had an effect on things that happened on the Earth. And the sphere after Mercury was the sphere of Venus. And Venus again, the planets in Dante, and particularly in Lewis in the Space Trilogy, they're presented in their unfallen state. We'll talk about what that means in just a minute. But the one after Venus was Sol, S-O-L, that's the sun. And then after the sun, the fifth heaven, was Mars. And then after Mars was Jupiter, the king of the planets. And then after Jupiter was Saturn, the ancient, melancholy, sorrowful, dreaded planet Saturn. And then after that, the realm of the stars. And that's where the zodiac signs existed. And then beyond that, outside of that, was the epicenter of heaven, the Imperium. That was beyond all motion, beyond all space, beyond all time. It was dwelling in the presence of God. And there's a lot to say, like modern pop presentations of this model get some things wrong. Like, they think that this model puts the Earth at the center, and therefore that means that for the ancients, the Earth was the most important thing. But one of the things that Lewis talks a lot about is actually, when you actually look at medieval literature, it was inverted. What we think as the center is actually the dregs of the universe, the lowest point of the universe. And that as you go up, you ascend into what is more important. So it's a very, like, you'll see this in Neil deGrasse Tyson or Carl Sagan or other kind of pop skeptics' presentation of ancient astronomy and the Copernican revolution and that stuff. And it's not like they get it entirely wrong, but they get it philosophically wrong, at least according to Lewis. And Michael Ward has actually written extensively on this in his book, Planet Narnia. And he has made the case, and it is, as far as I know, in Lewis scholarship, it's like a done deal. Like, everybody is persuaded. To my knowledge, I'm not a Lewis scholar, but from everything I've seen, Michael Ward made a successful, definitive case. Once you know this model, which Lewis describes in Lewis's book, The Discarded Image, An Introduction to Medieval and Renaissance Literature, he lays out the model. And in chapter 5, the heavens, he really spells this out. So if you want to see, like, that picture I just showed of the model, if you want to see Lewis's explanation, and he quotes all of the passages, like here's a quote from Chaucer, but he quotes extensively, here's from Gower, how they viewed the cosmos and the operations of the heavens, of the planets, what they did, how the primum mobile, that's the outermost sphere that moves, but it's the one that moves, and its movement moves everything else. And he cites, examples from all throughout medieval history. And then he gets into the planets themselves. He says, they're planets as well as gods. Not that the Christian poet believed in the god because he believed in the planet, but all three things, the visible planet in the sky, the source of influence, and the god, generally acted as a unity upon his mind. I've not found evidence that theologians were at all disquieted by this state of affairs. And so for Christian theologians, they didn't reject the idea of the Mercury and Venus and Jupiter, because they could see them, and they also believed that they did somehow affect like temperament and events on Earth. And, they didn't completely reject all astrology as entirely made up nonsense, but they did reject the divinity part of it, that those weren't gods. These planets, they had personalities. That's probably the best way to describe it, is all the planets. And that's, by planets, I don't mean Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Those weren't discovered yet. And I do mean the sun and the moon. They were included in the planet. So the medieval planets, the wanderers, they all had personalities. And so Lewis talks about here in Discarded Image, getting to know the personalities of the different planets helps you understand the model. So he has a section about each one, Saturn, and then Jupiter is where the word Jove is another name for Jupiter. So jovial, comes from being influenced by Jupiter. So the jovial character is cheerful, festive, yet temperate, tranquil, magnanimous. When this planet dominates, we may expect halcyon days and prosperity. In Dante, wise and just princes go to his sphere when they die. And he lists, I won't go into all this because this video will be a long one, but he talks about, maybe if you're interested in this, we'll do a future episode on it, but he talks about, the next one is Mars. And each of the planets, they not only had a god associated with them, but they also had a metal associated with them. And Mars' metal was iron. It says Mars makes iron. He gives men the martial temperament. That's where we're going, by the way, with martial arts. He gives men the martial temperament, sturdy hardiness, as the wife of Bath calls it. And there's the citation for that. But he is a bad planet in Fortuna Minor. He causes wars. His sphere in Dante is the heaven of martyrs, partly for the obvious reason, martyrs, those who are violently killed, those who die by the sword. And then Lewis says, but partly, I suspect, because of a mistaken philological connection between martyr, which is the word for martyr, martus, and martem, the name of the god. So Lewis says that it could be in Dante, and he's talking about Dante, he's talking about the Divine Comedy in Paradiso, that Mars is the sphere of the martyrs, probably because Dante got his philology a little bit off. But it could be because, again, those were the ones who had died violent deaths, the martyrs. And so here's the example in Dante's Paradiso, Canto 25, the very end. Dante actually meets one of his ancestors who had died during the Crusades. And it says, I followed him to war against the evil of that law whose adherents have usurped this through your pastor's fault, your just possessions. Talking about the Crusades and how the church had lured people into funding the Crusades. And then because it was a crusade and Dante's a product of his times and they believed that they were fighting against the hordes of godless people, it said there by that execrable race, whether it's talking about Muslims, Jews, or just enemies of God in particular. I don't know enough about Dante to weigh in on that, but basically I was killed by our enemies. He says, I was set free from fetters of the erring world, the love of which defiles so many souls. From martyrdom I came unto this peace. And it goes on. This is in Canto 27, still in that fifth sphere. Dante wants to know his future. He wants to ask, when you're among the heavens, you want to ask what's happening. He says, thus my desire would be appeased if I might know what fortune is approaching me. The arrow one foresees arrives more gently. So this is what he asks. Says, so did I speak to the same living light that spoke to me before. As Beatrice had wished, what was my wish was now confessed. So he asks what he wanted. Beatrice told him, ask what you want. He asks it. And then he's going to get an answer. But look what he says. Not with the maze of words that used to snare the fools upon this earth before the Lamb of God who takes away our sins was slain. He's talking about ancient mythology and ancient astrology and the gods, Mars, Venus, Jupiter. He refers to that, this is Dante, refers to that as a maze of words that used to snare the fools upon this earth. So rather than that, Dante says, but with words plain and unambiguous, that loving Father, hidden yet revealed by his own smile, replied. And then he goes on to talk about free will and determinism. It's a fascinating canto. It's Canto 27 in Paradiso. But this idea, Lewis really grabbed onto this. He believed that in the ancients, there was seeds of the gospel, echoes of the divine, and that authors like Dante had done a marvelous job picking up on it. And that's what Lewis wanted to do even more. And he wanted to do it through science fiction. He wanted to do it through his space trilogy. But how do you do that without adopting wholesale paganism, those words that confused people before the coming of Christ, in Dante's words? Well, this is at the point where that first sphere, that first heaven, really matters. Luna, the moon. In Discarded Image, Lewis says, "At Luna we cross in our descent the great frontier which I have so often had to mention, from heaven to nature, from the realm of necessity to that of contingence, from the incorruptible to the corruptible. Unless this great divide is firmly fixed in our minds, every passage in Donne or Drayton or whom you will that mentions translunary and sublunary will lose its intended force. We shall take under the moon as a vague synonym, like our under the sun, for everywhere, when in reality it is used with precision." He gives an example from Gower and another one from Chaucer and Canterbury Tales. And then he talks about, so the moon in the medieval model, the moon's metal is silver. Like Mars's metal was iron, the moon's metal is silver. And in men, she produces a wandering. And that in two senses. She may make them travelers, but she may also produce wandering of the wits, especially that periodical insanity which was first meant by the word lunacy. So lunacy or lunatic comes from this idea that being influenced by the luna, by the moon, leads to a wandering mentally, like being out of your mind. And then he also notes in Paradiso, in Dante, the moon sphere, the first one that Dante comes to, is inhabited by those who had entered conventual life, like the monastery or a convent, but had abandoned it, but for some good reason or pardonable reason. Not that they had just been like, I don't want to be a nun anymore, I'm out, but like they had been forced into a monastic or a nunnery life, and that for whatever reason they ended up leaving it, and they were penitent, but they you can read that canto in Paradiso. But that's why Dante puts those people. See, this is what helps make sense of Dante for me reading Lewis, is that you see, why did Dante assign certain people to the certain spheres of heaven, or certain types of people to the various spheres of heaven? And it had to do with that medieval model that Dante was working from. So what does any of this have to do with martial arts and the space trilogy? Well, in Christiana Hale's book, Deeper Heaven, A Reader's Guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy, I listened to this on Audible, and now I'm actually going back and rereading it on Kindle, because this is not a book you just listen to. This is a study resource. If you've read the Ransom Trilogy, or are you planning to read the Ransom Trilogy, do yourself a favor, even if you can't get through Lewis's Discarded Image, because it's kind of dense. I mean, it's only 200 pages, but it's heady stuff. It's academic. If you can't get through that, at least do yourself a favor and pick up Hale's book, Deeper Heaven. But in chapter 9 of this, it's called Gray-Eyed and Keen, the Martial Influence. And she talks about how Lewis, it's not an accident that he had his character Ransom go first to Malacandra. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read the Space Trilogy and you don't want to know anything else, stop this video now, go read at least Out of the Silent Planet, and then come back and pick this video up. So here's your warning. Okay, you're still here. That means you don't need the spoiler alert. He goes to Malacandra, which is Mars. And he didn't know that at first, but it ends up being Mars. Well, that's not accidental. And Ransom, over the course of the first book, goes from this frumpy, dumpy, mild-mannered philologist, word nerd, to a warrior, a martial prophet. And it happens, the formative stage of it happens after he passes the moon out of the silent planet. That's what Earth is known as, the silent planet, because all the other planets are still in communion with God. They never fell. Only when Satan fell, he fell to Earth. And Earth became the silent planet, because Satan was supposed to be the one who was kind of the archon over Earth, just like all the other Oyarses are the archons over the different planets. And Satan fell when he rebelled, and everything inside the orbit of the moon, everything within that sphere, this is Lewis kind of modernizing the ancient model, became silent, could no longer hear the music of the spheres, and they could no longer hear it. And so on Mars, so the reason Ransom goes to Mars, the first stage of his threefold journey, which follows Mars, and then Venus and Paralandra, he goes to Venus. And then in that hideous strength, he comes back to Earth, and then Jupiter, Jove, descends upon Earth, not the actual planet, but the one whom the planet personifies. So it all fits together because of Lewis's model. And it's on Malacandra, Mars, where Ransom becomes martial. Not in the fallen worldly sense of like violent and warlike, because one of the fascinating things is when he goes to Malacandra, in the process of becoming Malacandrian, he learns from the most martial of the three races on the planet, the one that where he becomes the warrior. He learns that they don't even have a word for war, because again, this is an unfallen society. And so Hale spells this out, taking from Discarded Image, what we just looked at. This is what she says. On Earth, Mars is known as Infortuna Minor, literally the lesser unfortunate, second to Saturn's Infortuna Major, because here in the sublunar realm, where sin holds sway, Mars's influence is easily corrupted. Mars leads readily to martial cruelty, trouble, haughtiness, gracelessness, mercenaries, insolence, coldness. Martial men can be heartless, cruel, and tyrannical. That's sublunar, on the Earth. Sinful humanity under the influence of the martial sphere. But above the orbit of the moon, in the sphere of Mars himself, there's nothing bad or corrupt per se. The martial virtues, strength, justice, keenness, courage, helping the weak, laughter in the face of danger can be found on Earth as well, but due to the fall are never encountered in their purest form as they appear on Mars himself, like on the planet Malacandra. This is the model that Lewis is presenting theologically with its theological implications in the Space Trilogy. Remember, the ancients believed that the planets could affect things on the Earth, like they were so powerful, they were so strong, not because they were gods in the Christian version of the model, but because they were powerful and God had given them as part of his creation dominion, like the greater light and the lesser light in Genesis has dominion over the day. And it says, and God also made the stars. So kind of piggybacking on that idea that the planets in their purest creationness can exert influence. And so Hale says these are the characteristics that we encounter on Malacandra. In fact, Ransom comes under the effects of Mars's personality before he even leaves Earth, for his adventures are set in motion due to his own martial determination to keep his word to Henry's mother. There was a woman who had lost her son, and her son had something of a disability, like mentally. And so he promised he would go to this cottage and try to find him and bring him back, even though he doesn't want to, even though it's a little unnerving, but he makes the decision to do it. He's faced with both the obstacle of the hedge, he's got to climb through a hedge, and his own unwillingness to put himself out any further on her behalf. Yet his promise compels him to proceed. In breaking through the hedge, he's unknowingly setting the whole adventure in motion, for there he runs in to Weston and Divine. And those are the two figures who end up shanghaiing him off to Mars to give him as what they think is a sacrifice to the savages that inhabit Mars. And that's the deliciousness of this book, as they turn out to be anything but. And so this idea of like an unfallen martial spirit, an unfallen martial influence permeates the first volume of Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. Ransom on Mars becomes martial in the good sense, because then he's going to be sent to Venus and he's going to have a job to do that is martial on Venus. And then when he comes back to Earth, that martial spirit combined with the motherliness of Venus and all of the things that he picks up there are going to be needed as he then helps this couple, Mark and Jane, really save their marriage, but also save the world. So knowing this medieval model, having an idea of what these bodies were, what the planets signified to the medieval mind, will help you directly see how Lewis is casting them in the Space Trilogy. And also, as Michael Ward has shown, it makes a whole lot more sense of the Narnia books as well. And that's more than we can get into in this video. I mean, that would be a whole nother video on its own about the planets in the Narnia series. But once you learn it, it makes that series come alive in a whole new way too. So the idea, bringing it back full circle, the idea of Mars and the martial spirit is something that unknowingly, that's always appealed to me. Ever since I was a little boy, I remember I couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. And my parents, this was like early 80s, probably like 82, 83. I remember I had this sleeveless, because everything cool in the 80s was sleeveless. I had this little sleeveless shirt with a samurai on it, like an old school ukiyo-e depiction of a samurai, like where the body's all flattened out, and like a Japanese woodblock print. I wish I could find the design to this day because it's one of my earliest memories. And I remember just loving that shirt, and I had no idea why. I didn't know what samurai were. I didn't even know what martial arts was at the time. I just thought, this is so cool. There is something about this warrior. He had a spear, I think, not a sword, but the way he was standing and ready for battle. Then when I started getting a little older and I started watching He-Man, man, I would get so pumped when He-Man would come on. You know that Filmation, like every 80s kid knows exactly. If you're a guy watching this and you're like 42 to 48, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That little Filmation banner comes up, and then that music, the red background, and He-Man comes up and boom, punches the camera. What about that appealed to me? Well, He-Man always protected the weak, fixed what was wrong, did what was right, stood up to the bullies, helped the people that needed help. I didn't know it at the time, but that's what it was. It was the martial spirit. It was what the medieval knights, in the purest sense, in their most ideal form, aspired to be. Now, of course, in real history, they were fallen and sinful. And in the sublunar realm, on this earth, the effects of the fall wrap its tendrils into everything that's good and distort it in some way. So everything good gets distorted, including the martial spirit. But as I got a little older, I watched Rocky and I was like, man, I want to do boxing. Well, you can't box by yourself, and there are not a lot of boxing gyms for, at the time, 7-year-olds. So, but then I saw Karate Kid. That came out, saw that in the theater, and was like, I can do that. I can learn karate. So I started doing karate, and I never stopped martial arts since then. And throughout it all, there was always this desire. Martial arts was all, people are like, well, how can you do martial arts as a Christian? It's just teaching you how to fight. And it's hard to explain to some people. They're so wrapped up in their legalism or their superstition or their fear of anything that's not the form of Christianity they were raised with, that you're not going to be able to explain it to some people. But I would try to explain it to people. What I was trying to explain was what Lewis talks about, the martial influence. Martial arts at their best are intended to equip people to do things that are martial, not in the fallen worldly combat only sense, but in the sense of a virtue, in the sense of nobility, in the sense of honor, in the sense of being powerful, not for the sake of being powerful and lording it over others, but for the sake of being able to rescue or help others. There's so much to the martial spirit. There's a reason that fight scenes in movies thrill some people. And yeah, there is a fallen sense. Like there's some people who they watch, let's say MMA, or boxing or kickboxing or, some football. They want to see the violence. There's a meme back from the early days of UFC of this drunk dude at a fight, and he's got painted on his head, it says UFC, and on his chest it's painted "Just Bleed." And he became kind of a joke in MMA circles as the "Just Bleed" guy, just sort of the symbol of like meathead, bloodlust, frat boy, grown up, still trying to live that wannabe violent lifestyle. I mean, it's just, I don't know. The guy could be perfectly nice and just had one too many that night. I don't know. But that's what the meme became. The meme became this, what people think of when they think of mixed martial arts, is just people wanting to see like the gladiator spectacle, wanting to see violence. And UFC didn't help themselves for many years. Their opening theme was a gladiator getting ready to go into battle, which is just dumb for a number of reasons, but it also evokes that fallen side of what it means to be martial: violence, bloodlust, iron, swords, killing. The noble, the redeemed martial spirit. That's what Lewis wanted to portray in Volume 1 of Out of the Silent Planet. And I think he does a brilliant job of it. the idea of a warrior race that don't have a word for war, that can't understand when he meets the Hrasa, that's the characters that he meets, they can't understand why anybody would fight a war. Why would you not use your training for the hunt, the thrill of the hunt, and providing? And there was a villain. There's even like the chaos Kampf motif, the chaos serpent motif that we see in ancient cultures and in scripture of the god overcoming the chaos serpent, the watery dragon. Like there's one of those in Out of the Silent Planet. And that's what the Hrasa train and hone their weapons and live their lives to do battle against. And it's a celebration. It's a glorious thing. It's part of their ethos. So that's one of the reasons that I love so much. And I didn't even know it when I first read it. Why do I love this book so much? The first volume in particular. And that's why. I just put it together reading Hale and Dante and Lewis's own words in Discarded Image. That's what it is. There's something appealing about unfallen, pure, redeemed martialness. And Lewis actually wrote a poem. There's a series of poems he wrote called The Planets, and it was filled with alliteration. I'm going to do my best to read it. Hale quotes it in this chapter. This is what he wrote about Mars. If you want to understand what martial means in the ancient cosmological sense that Lewis was drawing from, here's Lewis's poem. Mars, mercenary, makes there his camp and flies his flag, flaunts laughingly the graceless beauty, gray-eyed and keen, blonde insolence of his blithe visage, which is hard and happy. He hews the act, the indifferent deed with dint of his mallet and his chisel of choice. Achievement comes not, unhelped by him, hired gladiator of evil and good. All's one to Mars, the wrong righted, rescued meekness, or trouble in trenches with trees splintered, and birds banished banks filled with gold, and the liar made lord. Like handiwork he offers to all, earns his wages and whistles the while. White-feathered dread Mars has mastered, his metals iron that was hammered through hands into holy cross, cruel carpentry. He is cold and strong, necessity's song. This is Lewis trying to depict how the ancients viewed Mars. Not necessarily the Greek or the Roman version of Mars, but the planet, the archetype of Mars. In the sublunar fallen realm, Mars is all of these contradictory things. Even being part of the cross itself, the nails hammered through hands into holy cross, cruel carpentry, playing on the idea of what was Jesus? Jesus the carpenter. And Mars's metal was hammered through those hands cruelly. So there's an element of that. This is Mars in its fallenness. And so what Lewis tries to do in Out of the Silent Planet is what Dante tried to do in Paradiso, which is say, what would it look like? What would an unfallen martial spirit look like? And not just Mars, but the other planets as well. But anyway, this video, I mean, if you're like, okay, wait, but what does this have to do with the Bible? You know, this isn't an exegetical video. This is just one of our kind of literary asides. But because so much of what we do here at Disciple Dojo is directly patterned after the concept of martial arts, the training, the sparring, the iron sharpening iron, making one another better, whether it's intellectually with arguments, whether it's through our refugee jitsu program where we teach kids literally how to protect themselves, to not be bullies, and to stand up for other kids against bullies in order to increase shalom, to bring peace to the little bit that we can here on earth, knowing that that's not the ultimate solution, and knowing that it should always be a last resort in some instances, also knowing that under this sublunary realm that we live in, there's times when the martial spirit is what's needed. I think it might have been Chesterton or Lewis. I can't remember, one of the two, but they said children are going to grow up and encounter dragons. And so we need to prepare them with images of knighthood for when they face those dragons. And I'm mangling the quote, but you can Google it. It's a very famous quote. But that's what I love about Out of the Silent Planet and the atmosphere that Lewis paints of that world, Malacandra, Mars, but not Mars according to the ancients, but Mars through the lens of the gospel. It's fascinating. I'm thoroughly enjoying this reread. So good. It's so good. But I just want to make this video, if nothing else, to get my thoughts out there and to help me process through. But hopefully this is interesting and helpful to some of you, especially if you are reading Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. And if you're not, you need to. So that'll do it for now. Appreciate you watching. And as always, thank you to those of you that subscribe, that help support this channel. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. And as always, in the meantime, keep training.